Imagine being trapped in a cold forest, surrounded by enemy soldiers, dwindling supplies, no way to contact your allies.
Sounds pretty dire.
Yeah, and that was the reality for over 500 American soldiers, known as the Lost Battalion during World War I.
Oh, I've heard of them, the Lost Battalion. A truly harrowing story.
We're going to dive deep into their story today.
Good to me.
Focusing on their leadership, their bravery, and just the sheer grit of these soldiers who endured just unimaginable hardship and fought truly against all odds.
I'm ready when you are.
All right, so we'll be looking at 2 episodes of the podcast, History That Doesn't Suck, to give us the inside story of this pivotal moment in American military history.
A great podcast, by the way. It really brings history to life.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites for sure. All right, so to set the stage, it's 1918, the final months of World War I.
The clock is ticking.
Yes. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, this massive Allied push against German forces, is underway in northeastern France.
One of the largest and deadliest battles the U.S. Army has ever faced.
And the terrain, the Argonne forest itself, was brutal.
Yeah, a dense forest, limited visibility.
Perfect for German defenses.
Exactly. It was a nightmare for the attacking forces.
So within this chaotic landscape we find the Lost Battalion, part of the 77th Division made up mostly of young men from New York City.
A lot of them recent immigrants, too.
And they were led by Major Charles Whitley, a lawyer turned soldier, not your typical gung-ho military leader.
From what I've read, he was a fascinating character. Galloping Charlie, they called him, known for his courage and discipline.
But also his deep care for his men. Not exactly the stereotype of a hard-nosed, emotionless officer.
Yeah, more of a compassionate leader, which is interesting given the circumstances.
So how did they end up lost in the first place?
Oh, it sounds like a series of unfortunate events, almost a perfect storm of aggressive tactics, miscommunication, and just plain bad luck.
So walk me through it.
So they were ordered to push aggressively into enemy territory.
Makes sense. Standard military tactic.
But the flanking units, both French and American, they failed to keep pace.
Oh, so they got too far ahead.
Exactly. Which left Whitley's battalion isolated, completely surrounded deep within German lines.
Wow, that's a bad spot to be in.
To say the least, they called their hastily formed defensive position the pocket.
The pocket.
And it quickly became a living hell.
Surrounded, low on supplies, under constant attack.
They were forced to scavenge from the dead and drink from a contaminated brook.
Just trying to picture that level of desperation. It's chilling.
And then, to make matters worse, they endured friendly fire from their own artillery.
Oh, no.
A tragic case of miscommunication and the fog of war leading to devastating consequences.
It's hard to believe they didn't just surrender at that point.
Well, the Germans, they sensed their vulnerability, sent a captured American soldier with a white flag to offer them a chance to surrender.
Really? So what went through their minds in that moment?
It's a testament to their grit, to their determination to survive. They chose to fight on, clinging to hope even when it seemed like all was lost.
Against all odds.
And it's here that we see the incredible story of Cherami, the carrier pigeon.
Cherami. Yeah, that bird became a legend.
Delivering a critical message despite being shot through the breast, wing, and leg. It's hard to believe. It's almost like something out of a movie.
It really is. That bird deserves a medal. So while the Lost Battalion was clinging to survival, another incredible story was unfolding elsewhere in the Argonne forest.
Yeah, this is where we get to the legendary Alvin York.
Alvin York. His actions were nothing short of extraordinary, so tell me about him. What did he do?
While the Lost Battalion was trapped, Corporal Alvin York, a sharpshooter from Tennessee, he was single-handedly taking on the Germans with incredible bravery and skill.
So this one guy was taking on how many Germans?
He silenced multiple machine guns and captured over 130 German soldiers.
130? That's incredible.
His story is almost unbelievable.
He was a conscientious objector at first, wasn't he?
You're right. York initially opposed the war, based on his religious beliefs, but when duty called, he answered with astonishing courage.
That's a powerful testament to the complexities of war.
Absolutely. It reminds us that heroism can emerge from unexpected places, and that even deeply held convictions can evolve under extraordinary circumstances.
York's actions were incredible, but the Lost Battalion's fate ultimately hinged on the efforts of other units, especially those tasked with breaking through the German lines to rescue them.
Absolutely. Their rescue was part of a much larger operation, a desperate effort to break the stalemate in the Argonne. It was the 82nd Division, spearheaded by units like the Big Red One, that finally smashed through the German defenses.
Until how long?
After 7 grueling days.
7 days. Imagine what those men in the pocket went through during that time.
The sources describe the rescue as a chaotic, bloody affair. It wasn't a Hollywood ending for the Lost Battalion, was it?
Not at all. Only about half the men who entered that pocket ever made it out. And those who survived, many were grievously wounded, both physically and mentally. The impact on them and on their leader, Major Whitley, was profound.
It's really tragic. Whitley, he struggled after the war. He constantly deflected praise, focusing on his men's courage instead of his own leadership, and then tragically took his own life a few years later.
Wow, that's heartbreaking.
Makes you wonder, did that humility stem from genuine selflessness, or was it a way to cope with the trauma he experienced? It's a question many leaders in high-stress situations grapple with, even today.
And it's a question that's hard to answer, especially from such a distance. But his story really does underscore the hidden burdens of leadership and the enduring trauma of war.
He's remembered as a hero, but his personal struggle highlights the importance of recognizing and addressing the mental health needs of veterans.
Something that wasn't widely understood or acknowledged back then.
Right. We've come a long way in understanding PTSD and the effects of trauma, but we still have a long way to go.
Before we move on, you mentioned the use of Choctaw code talkers. In your notes, I didn't realize that tactic went back as far as World War I.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The challenging terrain and communication breakdowns in the Argonne led to the ingenious use of Native American languages, particularly Choctaw, for secure battlefield communication.
Really? So they were using Choctaw to transmit messages that the Germans couldn't understand.
Precisely. It was an early chapter in the remarkable history of code talkers, who would go on to play a crucial role in World War II.
That's amazing. I had no idea it went back that far.
The Lost Battalion's ordeal, it almost seems like a microcosm of the larger battle raging around them. It's incredible to think about what else was happening in the Meuse-Argonne offensive while those men were fighting for their lives in that pocket.
The Meuse-Argonne offensive was a massive undertaking. It involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, complex strategies, political maneuvering at the highest levels, so much more to explore.
Absolutely.
But we'll have to save that for our next deep dive.
I'm looking forward to it. So the Allies were up against a formidable foe in the Argonne. They were trying to break through what was known as the Hindenburg Line.
Oh yeah, the Hindenburg Line, a complex network of fortifications. The Germans had spent years building it, right?
That's right. You're probably familiar with trench warfare from your other readings, but the Hindenburg Line was on another level.
Yeah.
It was a series of heavily fortified trenches, concrete bunkers, barbed wire entanglements, machine gun nests. Just incredibly difficult for the Allies to make any headway.
The podcast described the terrain as a natural fortress, which the Germans had further reinforced. I can see why it was such a brutal fight. And on top of that, many of the American troops were relatively inexperienced, weren't they?
Exactly. They were fresh-faced recruits, many of whom had only arrived in Europe a few months prior, and they were facing seasoned German soldiers who had been fighting for years and knew the terrain intimately.
Wow, that must have been a daunting experience, being thrown into that kind of meat grinder. It makes you wonder what General Pershing, the AEF commander, was thinking. He must have been under immense pressure to achieve a breakthrough.
Absolutely. Pershing was a demanding leader, determined to prove the American Army's capabilities. But he was also walking a tightrope, facing pressure from the French, who were pushing for a more aggressive strategy while also needing to preserve American lives and autonomy.
It sounds like Pershing wasn't the type to shy away from a challenge.
Not at all.
Your sources describe him as strong-willed, even stubborn at times. I imagine that led to some clashes with his Allied counterparts.
There certainly were. Pershing was adamant about maintaining American control over American forces,
Right.
which led to friction with the French, particularly Prime Minister Clemenceau,
Oh, yeah.
who had his own ideas about how the war should be fought.
I read about a heated argument between Pershing and Marshal Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander. That must have been a tense situation. Two strong personalities clashing over strategy in the middle of a war.
It highlights the human element of these large-scale conflicts. Even amidst the grand strategies and military maneuvers, it often came down to personalities, egos, and personal relationships. Pershing stood his ground, though, defending the American Army's performance and insisting on being treated as an equal partner, not just a supporting player.
And while all this was happening, the battles continued to rage on multiple fronts. You paint a vivid picture in your notes of just the horrific scenes of carnage and suffering, the thousands of casualties.
The human cost of the Meuse-Argonne offensive was staggering. Both sides suffered immensely. And it's important to remember that, amidst the talk of strategies and objectives, it was ultimately individual soldiers who paid the price.
One story that really struck me was the one about General MacArthur and the attack on Côte de Châtillon. It perfectly illustrates the kind of decisions and sacrifices that were happening throughout this offensive.
MacArthur, who was a brigadier general at the time, was tasked with capturing a heavily fortified German position. He knew it was going to be a tough fight, and that casualties were likely to be high. He even told his superior officer, "We'll take it, or my name will head the list." That's how determined he was to succeed.
Talk about putting everything on the line. Did they manage to capture the position?
They did, but it was a brutal fight. MacArthur's brigade faced fierce resistance, and the battle raged for hours. They finally succeeded in taking Côte de Châtillon, but the cost was heavy. MacArthur himself later described it as a desolate scene of death and destruction.
It's sobering to think about the weight of those decisions. Sending men into harm's way knowing that some of them wouldn't come back. It seems like every victory came at a terrible cost.
That's the harsh reality of war. Even amidst moments of heroism and strategic brilliance, there's always a price to be paid.
You mentioned the use of Choctaw code talkers earlier. I'm still fascinated by that. It's incredible how the Americans were able to adapt and innovate, even in the heat of battle.
It speaks to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the American soldiers and their commanders. They were facing a critical communication problem. The Germans were intercepting their radio transmissions, and traditional methods of communication were too slow and unreliable. In the challenging terrain of the Argonne forest, someone had the bright idea of using the Choctaw language, which was completely unknown to the Germans, to transmit messages.
That's brilliant. I can only imagine the confusion on the German side trying to decipher these unfamiliar sounds.
It proved incredibly effective. The Choctaw code talkers were able to relay vital information quickly and securely, playing a key role in several battles, including the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It paved the way for the wider use of code talkers, particularly Navajo code talkers, in World War II.
It sounds like the tide was turning in favor of the Allies as October wore on. They'd breached the Hindenburg Line in several places and were pushing the Germans back. But it was still a long way from over, wasn't it?
That's right. The Germans were still a formidable foe, and they were determined to hold on. The Kriemhilde-Stellung, another heavily fortified defensive position, proved to be a major obstacle. The Americans, however, were relentless in their attacks, and by mid-October, they had managed to punch through the line in several places.
You mentioned the 32nd Division playing a pivotal role in breaking through at a place called Côte-de-Marie. They exceeded all expectations, didn't they?
Absolutely. The 32nd was comprised mainly of National Guard units from Michigan and Wisconsin. They were relatively inexperienced, like many American units, and they were up against some of the toughest fighting of the entire offensive. But they persevered, demonstrating incredible courage and tenacity. Their breakthrough at Côte-de-Marie was a major turning point in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, opening up a path for further advances.
And all this time, the Lost Battalion's ordeal was unfolding in the background. It's a reminder that while armies clashed and generals strategized, individual soldiers were fighting for their lives in every corner of the battlefield.
Precisely. The Lost Battalion's story, though extraordinary in its own right, is just one small piece of a much larger and complex puzzle. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was a vast canvas of individual acts of courage, strategic brilliance, and tragic loss. It reminds us that war is fought on many levels, and that behind the grand narratives, there are countless human stories waiting to be told.
So it sounds like the Meuse-Argonne offensive was reaching a critical point by late October. The Allies were making progress, but the Germans were still fighting hard. What was the overall strategic situation at that point?
Well, you have to remember that by this point in the war, Germany was facing a crisis on multiple fronts.
Wow.
The Allies were pushing forward in the West, and their resources were stretched thin. On top of that, their allies were crumbling. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, they were all on the verge of collapse. It was only a matter of time before the whole edifice came crashing down.
So those events on other fronts, far from the Argonne forest, were having a direct impact on what was happening in the Meuse-Argonne offensive.
Absolutely. It's all connected. The Germans' weakening position elsewhere meant they had fewer resources to commit to the fight in the Argonne.
Right.
Made it much harder for them to sustain their defenses in the face of the relentless American attacks.
And back in Germany, it sounds like things were getting pretty chaotic. You mentioned a socialist revolutionary named Karl Liebknecht calling for the Kaiser's overthrow.
Yes, Liebknecht was a prominent figure in the German socialist movement, and he was a vocal critic of the war from the very beginning. He saw the Germans' weakening position as an opportunity to spark a revolution and overthrow the monarchy. His call for the Kaiser's removal reflected the growing social unrest and war weariness within Germany itself.
And then there were those mutinies within the German Navy. It really does seem like the whole system was teetering on the brink of collapse.
Those mutinies were a clear sign that the German war effort was unraveling. Sailors in the port of Kiel, fed up with the war and inspired by revolutionary fervor, rebelled against their officers, refusing to follow orders and demanding an end to the fighting. It spread quickly to other naval bases, and it was a crucial turning point. It signaled that the German people, even those in the military, had reached their breaking point.
So with all of this turmoil happening, the Meuse-Argonne offensive was still grinding on. What were the final days of the battle like?
The Americans continued to press their attack, pushing the exhausted German forces back and inflicting heavy casualties. By early November, they had reached the outskirts of Sedan, a strategic town on the Meuse River that held significant historical weight.
You mentioned in your notes that capturing Sedan would have been a huge symbolic victory for the French. But why was Sedan so important?
Sedan wasn't just any town. Back in 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians decisively defeated the French army at Sedan. It led to the capture of Emperor Napoleon III and ultimately the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. For the French, Sedan represented a humiliating defeat, a national trauma that had lingered for decades. Retaking Sedan would have been a huge morale boost, almost like erasing that painful memory from their history.
So the Americans were on the verge of delivering this symbolic victory to their allies. It sounds like they were determined to see it through.
They were. On November 6th, American units were poised to capture Sedan. When news arrived that an armistice had been signed, the fighting was over.
So after weeks of brutal fighting, the Meuse-Argonne offensive ended not with a climactic battle, but with a negotiated truce. It's almost anticlimactic in a way.
That's how many wars end, not with a grand, decisive battle, but with a whimper. A recognition that both sides have had enough. It's often negotiations and political maneuvering that ultimately determine the outcome.
And it's a reminder that even in the midst of all the chaos and bloodshed, diplomacy still has a role to play.
Absolutely. Diplomacy is often the only way out of these conflicts, even if it's a messy and imperfect process.
Looking back on it all, I keep coming back to these individual stories. Cher Ami delivering that message, General MacArthur leading that attack, Corporal York silencing those machine guns. They all highlight how these grand historical events often come down to moments of individual action and decision.
Exactly. Those individual stories are what make history so compelling and relatable. They remind us that behind the grand narratives, behind the sweeping pronouncements of generals and politicians, it's ultimately individual people who bear the burden of war. Their stories of courage, resilience, loss, and sacrifice are what give history its human dimension.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Lost Battalion and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, what are the key takeaways? What should we be thinking about?
I think there are several important things to consider. First, it's a stark reminder of the human cost of war, both for those who fight and for the societies that send them into battle. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was one of the deadliest conflicts in American history, and the Lost Battalion's ordeal is a microcosm of the suffering endured by so many. It forces us to grapple with the immense price of war, the physical and emotional scars that it leaves behind.
It really makes you appreciate the courage and resilience of those soldiers fighting for their lives in such horrific conditions.
And that leads to the second takeaway, the extraordinary power of the human spirit. The Lost Battalion's refusal to surrender, their determination to survive against overwhelming odds is truly inspiring. And it's not just them. Stories like Alvin York's remind us that even in the darkest of times, individuals can rise to the occasion and perform incredible acts of bravery.
We also can't forget the importance of effective leadership. Major Whitley's compassion An unwavering commitment to his men played a crucial role in their survival. It makes you think about what true leadership really means, especially in those life or death situations.
Absolutely. Whitley's story and his tragic fate remind us that leadership comes with heavy burdens. It's not just about giving orders, it's about inspiring trust, fostering camaraderie, and caring for those under your command. It's a lesson that resonates even today in all walks of life.
And lastly, we have to recognize the significance of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. In the broader context of World War I, it was a turning point, a demonstration of American military might and commitment that helped tip the scales in favor of the Allies.
The Meuse-Argonne offensive was the final major battle of World War I, and it played a crucial role in forcing Germany to the negotiating table. It was a hard-fought victory, achieved at a terrible cost, but it ultimately contributed to the end of that devastating conflict and the shaping of the 20th century.
This has been an incredible deep dive. You've shared some amazing sources about the Lost Battalion and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and it's given us all a lot to think about as we reflect on this pivotal moment in history. It begs the question, what lessons can we learn from the Meuse-Argonne offensive that are still relevant today? How can we honor the sacrifices of those who fought, not just by remembering their stories, but by applying the lessons of the past to the challenges we face in the present? That's something for all of us to ponder as we move forward.